Okay. Let me move my participants bar. All right. So in this third workshop section, we are going to be learning about JavaScript. JavaScript is really important because that's how we can make our websites interactive. So a lot of you guys have been asking questions on the questions doc about if I click a button, how do I make it do something? Or how would I show a series of images on my screen instead of just showing one? Like, how do I make it change? How do I make my website dynamic? How do I allow the user to interact with it? There's a lot of benefit in having a website that looks nice. A lot of our hack websites that you see and interact with, like our day of website that we sent out with all the schedule and stuff, that's mostly HTML and CSS with a little bit of JavaScript for button clicking. But for some more hefty projects, you're really going to rely on JavaScript. So something like our backend platform, it might be more important. So let me go here. Okay. So JavaScript is the programming language that we use to manipulate the content of a web page and make it interactive. As you can see, as I mentioned before, here we have a button. It says click me. So we try and click it. And we want to be able to tell it what to do if I click it. Because right now, all the buttons on our website, they look pretty. We can click them, but they don't do anything. If we wanted to say click the button and have it just display world instead of hello, by the end of this JavaScript lecture, you will know how to do that or have some idea about how you would go about doing that. One thing I want to get out of the way, some of you may have heard of something called Java. Java is another programming language. So there's JavaScript, there's Java. Java is actually the basis for AP Comp Sci classes. So if you've taken that or plan to take that, you will probably experience some Java in your future. JavaScript is not the same as Java. JavaScript is basically exclusively used for web pages and for doing things in your browser. So when we say like in your browser, it means on the client side. So JavaScript is a separate thing to Java. They have some syntactical similarities, but also they're super different in many, many ways. So if you've heard of one, just know that they are separate things. So first of all, let's just test JavaScript out in our browser. As you can probably remember, Jess and Robert showed you guys how you can inspect element and see what the HTML, CSS of a page looks like. You can also inspect element, and I'm just going to do it on Google Docs. So we have our elements here. You have this other tab next to it called console, and brilliantly, it brings up a JavaScript console for you. I think they were having some issues. We don't need to worry about that. But basically, what you can do in this console is you can just type in JavaScript and it won't do anything to the web page, but you can see a little bit about how it works as a programming language. So I'm not sure if you guys have experience with previous programming languages, but basically the first traditional thing to do when you are entering a new programming language is to print out hello world. And the way you print things in JavaScript is by doing console.log. And then you write the set of characters or the string that you want to display to the screen. And as you can see, I've typed console log and it is showing hello world back at me. So that is what a console.log is. Console.log prints things and it's telling us hello world. All right, so now let's get into, I'm going to close the developer tools, go back to the slideshow, and let's get into some JavaScript syntax. So in programming, a lot of the time we want to use variables. A variable is basically a container, and in that container, you store a piece of data. It's really similar a lot of the time to the way you use variables in math, where in math you might say like variable x equals 5. And in that case, the name x, the variable name x, is storing the value 5. In programming, we use that a lot because it helps us manipulate data in a very nice way. And it also helps us say like with a function, and it's the same as a function in math, if I get a variable x, I'll like add 5 to it. If you've done functions in math, you know, like f of x. So the way we define variables, and that's just creating a variable in JavaScript, you write let foo equals 5. And it can be any name you want. We just picked foo here. But that means whenever you reference the word foo, it will connect you to the value 5. So it stores the number 5 in the variable named foo. As we saw before, you can console.log. When you console.log foo, you print the number 5 to the screen. And we can try this in our console. Let me go back to our console. we can say let foo equal 5. And then console.log foo. And now foo displays as 5, which is great. Okay. So now a variable wouldn't be much use to us if it was always 5, because then we should just use the number 5. The real power that comes with variables is the fact that we can manipulate them and change them. So here we start by saying let foo equals 5, and we can update foo to say foo equals 6. And this is, again, very similar to a variable in math, just setting foo to be 6 now instead of 5. So down below, if we console.log foo again, it will print 6 to the screen instead of 5. We have some really neat syntax in JavaScript that is called plus equals. So the way that plus equals works is it's like adding something to foo and then setting foo equal to the new value. And I'm going to demo this one because this can be kind of a tricky concept if you haven't seen it before. So console. And also when you're working in JavaScript on your own, you don't have to do it in the browser like this. I'm just doing this because it's much easier for me to interact with it. So we say let foo equals 6. I'm just going to say 6 for now. And then if we want to say foo plus equals 4, it will tell us, okay, now the value of foo is 10 if I just access foo. So foo plus equals 4. This is the same as saying foo equals foo plus 4. That's basically what this nice little plus equals syntax does. Foo equals foo plus 4. So we are adding 4 to foo, and it's now, as you can see, it was 10 before, now it's 14. So we're setting it equal to the new value. If I just did foo plus 4, it says 18, right? But foo is still 14. And that's because I didn't set foo equal to that value, because I didn't say foo, this is your new value. It doesn't store that in the variable. All right. I'm going to do one more piece of foo syntax, I think, and then I'll pause for questions. So this is another little neat bit of JavaScript syntax. We're getting even more concise. If you are in a pinch, you can write foo plus plus. It's super short, compact syntax. That is the same thing as saying foo plus equals 1. So you're just adding 1 to foo. So if foo is 5 and I run foo plus plus, foo will be 6. So foo plus plus is the same as foo plus equals 1. You're adding 1 to foo and setting it equal to that new value. And I will stop for questions. Amanda and Jess, are there any questions on the doc that would be valuable to cover as a group?
Someone was asking about what exactly semicolons are for. So if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Honestly, the semicolons are a little bit optional. I think it's like technically you won't get that mad at you if you don't have it in there, which is why I don't know, you're not going to get thrown errors like you would in CSS, where it's crucial that you have the semicolons. However, just for like code structure and convention, it is much more like good to put semicolons in your code. There are probably some people who disagree with me about this for JavaScript, but I just think it's good practice to get in the habit of putting semicolons when you don't need them, rather than like just to be extra safe, because there are many programs in which it is super crucial that you have them. So yeah, good question though. All right, I will keep going, but continue asking your questions on the doc, and we'll keep going, we'll keep learning. All right, so now we have another way to declare variables. So I mentioned that you can say let a equals 5 and then set a equal to 7, right? We just showed that that's totally fine. We have another type of variable called a constant, and you could declare that by saying const b equals 5. The main thing to know about a constant is that you can't change it. As the name kind of suggests, constant is constant. So if I set b equals to 5, b will always, always, always be 5, and I can't change it. So when you're doing programming, especially web development programming, it's really important to think about when you want to use const and when you want to use let, because there are some variables that I never, ever, ever want to change. So maybe that's like screen size. I don't know why I would be using screen size, but maybe I'm storing the screen size and it's 300 pixels. I never want that value to change. Maybe let's say I always want it to be 300 pixels. I would make it a constant so that there's no way that the user can ever change it. But if it's something like username, if someone inputs their username, I would use let because I want to change that username. So that's the difference between let and const. Const is constant. You may have heard of something called var. Don't use it. The reason is something a little bit more complicated about variable scopes. Basically, var does not work the way that you will expect it to, especially when you're dealing with using variables in different places. So I think it's out of the scope of this course to cover that, but just as a rule of thumb, do not use var at all. Only use let and never use var. If you think you should be using var, you shouldn't, just use let. All right, so now I'm going to go over some primitive types in JavaScript. A primitive type in any programming language is just like a base level data type that you can interact with in order to do things. So in JavaScript, we have a few of them. We have numbers. Oh, wait, good question in the chat. So in the chat in JavaScript, I think what you're asking is like, you don't have to declare the type of a variable. So as you can see, if we go back, we are never telling it what type of value is going in this. Like in Java, you might have to say int a equals 5, like integer. In JavaScript, it's a lot more flexible. It's really similar to Python in that you can put whatever you want in your variables. You do not have to say what type it is or anything like that. Good question. All right, let me go back. Okay, so we have numbers, which is like positive numbers, negative numbers. We have these things with decimal extensions. They're not integers. They're called doubles or floats. You don't really need to remember the name, but it's helpful for other programming languages. We have these things called strings. Strings are just collections of characters. You've already seen strings when you're working in HTML and CSS. The URLs that we use for all strings, and we put them in these lovely double quotes. There's also a special kind of string that you can make, which I'll explain on the next page, where you use these backticks. They should be in the upper left-hand part of your keyboard, right next under the tilde, but they allow you to do some cool things. We have booleans, which can either be true or false. And then we have the values null and undefined, which come up when either a variable doesn't have a value or you've never given it a value. All right, so now I'm going to quickly explain what the backticks are. So we use backticks to create something called a template string. And the way a template string works is, if you look at this first line, I have a normal string, normal. And that's my name. Const name equals meme man. So we have meme man, and we've used our normal double quotes. But let's say I'm on my website and I want to display like a welcome screen. And my welcome screen should say yo, and then whatever the person's username is, right? I don't know every single time what their username is going to be. It might be a different person. So I can't just put in yo meme man, because what if someone else comes onto my website? What if someone that's not meme man shows up, and then I'm not prepared to give them their welcome to the website? Well, in that case, what we would do is we would create a template string. And the way this template string works is that you have to use the backticks, and then you can insert the value of a variable. So here we have this variable name. We're inserting the value of name into the sentence using this little $sign and these curly braces. So if my name is meme man, I'll display to the screen, yo, meme man. But if the value of const name is Lili, then when I go to the screen, I will display yo, Lili. So it's a way to make your strings more dynamic, and that can be super helpful. So now we have arrays. Arrays are also called lists. If you have experience from other programming languages, no worries if you don't. Basically, I'm going to go back to the other slide. Basically, all that an array is it's like a shopping list. There's a reason it's called a list. It's like an ordered collection of a bunch of elements. So you might have a list that's like 1, 2, 3, 4. And that would be a list that has 4 elements in it, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And lists are super helpful for dealing with like collections of things that you want to store. So we have arrays that look like this in JavaScript. So you declare an array, you go const array equals, and then these hard braces. An array is always denoted with hard braces. And then you can add things to your array by running array.push or array.push 6. And I'm going to do this in the console because I think this can be kind of a tricky concept. So let's do that. All right. So let's say const array. And we actually don't have to declare it empty. So I'm going to show you this works now the array is empty, but I can also say const array equals 1. 2, 3. I can put some things in there. And the way you put items in there is you put the item like the value is and then a comma. Maybe I'll add like meme man. I'll add myself. They don't have to all be of the same type. I can add a Boolean. Remember, Boolean is true or false. So we have this big array with lots of stuff in it. If I print array, it will show us all these things. And then let's say I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to add something else to my array. I want to add Amanda and Jess to my array. I'm going to do array.push, which is how we add something to the end of our array. I'll push Amanda. So let's see what the array looks like. The array has Amanda in it. And let's push Jess into the array as well. And let's look at the array. So Amanda and Jess are in the array now. A few very important things to note with arrays. One thing that you might be curious about, I declared const array, even though we're changing the value of the array. This is a little bit also out of the scope of Web Dev Beginner, but basically what an array is, it's actually a pointer to where these values exist in your computer's memory. So if I actually look at the value of array, it's like pointing to something. It's not actually that thing. So the pointer stays the same, but the stuff inside the pointer changes. And if this is going over your head, it's totally okay. But that's why it's a constant, because we're always pointing, the array is always in the same place. The things that are there just change. And this is very unique to arrays. So for every other kind of primitive data type that we talked about, it doesn't work like this. If you declare it as const, you won't be able to change it. But for an array, you can declare it as const and change what's inside of it, which might be kind of confusing. I think when I first heard about it, it was kind of confusing. Another thing is with arrays, you don't need to say array equals array.push. You just need to write array.push, and that will automatically update the value of array. Kind of like that plus equals syntax, it automatically sets it to be the new value. Are there any questions so far about arrays? Maybe from the questions doc.
Yeah, can you demonstrate how you like add an element to like a specific part of the list instead of just like pushing it at the end?
Good question. I actually forgot the syntax for that. It's a little embarrassing. Is it insert? Wait, I'm going to show you how you would figure this out if you are working on your hackathon project. You go array, insert element at index, JavaScript. This is a great lesson for you all. JavaScript. Okay, and then we see Stack Overflow, our favorite, and it is insert. So I was good at S there. Array.insert, and then index. So let's say index 2, and then or 3, and then item is hi. No, it doesn't like it. Okay, let's read this again. Oh, that was what they did wrong. It's okay. So this person is doing splice. Let's try it. We're just gonna do some experimenting. Okay, that worked. All right, so we did some Googling. You can use array.splice like this, I guess, inserting it at index 3. I know that's kind of an unsatisfying answer because I literally just Googled it in front of you. But yeah, I would definitely recommend Googling things if you don't know how to do it. That actually brings me to one other point though, because I tried to put in hi at index 3 and it put it in at position 4. Well, actually in the chat, you slightly can't do that. That does something different. That will change the value to be something else, but it won't insert something new at that position. But I said I want to insert hi at index 3, but it put it in at the position 4. And that's because in JavaScript, arrays are 0 indexed. And this is something else that's kind of confusing that I'm going to go over on this slide. So basically, when we look at the indices of an array, it starts at 0. So if I do array 0, it will print out that first element 1. If I print out array 3, it will print out hi, even though hi is at position 4. If I print out array 2, I'll print out 3, even though it's at position 3. So when we are working with arrays in Java, just remember it always starts at index 0. And what I'm doing here is I'm grabbing the item at that element. So I'm doing array hard brackets 0, and that's giving me the thing at position 0. So the way, and this was actually some syntax that was mentioned in the chat, but if you have array 3 equals hello, let's say I don't want to say hi anymore, it changes it to hello. So this is a super nice way you can interact with your arrays. All right. As you can see, the first element is 0, the second element is 1. And then if we try and go outside of the array, we're going to get an undefined. It will be mad at us. So always remember that this array is linked to, because we're indexing at 0, there is nothing at position 2. Something else we can do is we can just put a variable in there. It doesn't really matter. If we say that this I is 1, and then we put that in there, it will give us the thing at index 1. All right. So now we're going to talk about objects. I'm kind of just throwing a lot of JavaScript stuff at you, and then I will connect it to our web dev stuff soon. So we start with objects, and objects are kind of like dictionaries if you've used dictionaries in other languages. So all an object is you will define your person object, let's say. You can put curly braces around the data, and then you'll say the name property. So you just say, you give your properties whatever name you want, name property, colon, and that's going to be buka buka. And then our age property is going to be 22. So you can give an object as many properties as you want and call them whatever you want. Now later on, when you want to access these properties, you can just do person.name, and that will give you buka buka, or you can do person.age, and that will give you 22. You can also edit objects. The way you do this is you can do person dot and then add a new property that you want it to have. So person dot is alive equals true. And then if you tried to access person dot is alive, it would give you true. So I'm really happy that 22-year-old Buka Buka is alive and with us. That's great to hear. And just another piece of syntax, you can also access it this way if you are used to using dictionaries in other languages. Basically what you're doing is you're putting this little key thing inside of these quotation marks, making it a string, and accessing that part of person. This syntax also looks kind of like our array accessing syntax. So that is that. We also have conditionals. The way conditionals work is it will only run a certain piece of code if a certain condition is true. So let's say number equals 54. If the number is less than 100, we will run this code. Else, we will run this code. And this is quite similar to English in that the format is if, and then in these parentheses, you put a condition. So a condition is like an expression that will evaluate to true or false. So none is less than 100 is either true or false. If it's true, we'll run this first block of code. Otherwise, we'll run the second block of code. All right. So we also have another example here where let's say we have multiple conditions we want to test. So we want to say if it's 64, we're going to do something special. If the number is 54, we're going to do something else special. And then if it's in all other cases, if it's not 64 and it's not 54, we'll do something else. We'll say, I don't care about this number. Okay, so I'm going to pause because I just went through a lot. Arrays, objects, conditionals. Are there any questions?
The question in the chat is, can we define a class of objects and instantiate, or is that the only way to declare objects?
I'm not quite sure what you, I mean, I know that JavaScript is like technically an object-oriented scripting language. So you can have classes. You don't see it like that much in that way with objects, I don't think, but you technically could do it. Honestly, I think objects are used more in the like dictionary-esque sense than they are in the like other kinds of object-oriented programming. But you can define a class of objects if you actually want to. And you can Google that if you want to learn more about it, just because I think we're a little crunched for time in this lecture. Objects are kind of like struct, but not exactly the same. I would say, because an object is more like a specific instance, whereas like struct you can use you like make different like, it's struct is more of a template than object is, I think. But good questions. All right, I'm gonna keep going just because we do have a lot of material to cover, but I appreciate you guys sticking with me because I know this can be a lot, especially if this is one of your first times programming. Okay, loops. So loops are super important and really, really fun. Basically, the way a loop works is if you want to do a lot of code or repeat a lot of code, but you don't want to have to copy and paste the same block that you've written, you can use a loop to tell your code how many times you want to repeat it or until when you want to repeat it and things like that. So we have something called for loops. The way a for loop works is you will specify a number of times that you want the loop to run, and it will run it that many times. So this is called a for each loop that you're seeing. And the way that it works is we have this list, this array of people. They're all strings. And then for each person of people, you want to log person. And you can see we're saying for const person of people. This word person is completely arbitrary. We're basically saying for this arbitrary variable person of people, that basically tells JavaScript to take every item in people and shove it into this little variable person that we're making, log person. So I could just as easily say for const x of people, console.log x. As long as these two things are the same, you can call it whatever you want. And what this will do is it will print out every person in people. So for person of people, for every person in people, you will print out that person. We also have something called a while loop. The way a while loop works is you'll give it a condition, very similar to our if statement. You'll put the condition in parentheses, and the condition will either be true or false. If the condition is true, you will keep running this. If it's false, you stop. So in this code, what we have is we're saying number is 10. While the number is less than 100, we're going to log that number to the console, and then we're going to add 1 to our number. So after we keep adding 1 until number gets to 100, this loop will stop running. Next, we have functions. So functions in programming are really similar to functions in math, where you have an input and an output and some steps in between. So all that a function is you're putting some stuff in, you're doing things to it, and then you're giving back something to the program. So the way a function works is you declare it like this. You say function, the function name, these two parentheses, which I'll tell more about in a bit. And then in brackets, you have the function body. So when you want to call the function, and that just means run it, because the function doesn't run when you just write it here, it just like exists. It's like defining an f of x, but you're not putting anything in, you're not saying like f of 6. And then here, when we want to call it, we just put the name of the function and then these parentheses. So in this example, what we're doing is we added something called name. In this case, name is the input. It's like x in f of x. So we say hello to name. And then we're using this special backtick syntax that I mentioned earlier. And we're saying, hi there, name. When we want to call this function, we have to actually give it a name. So we put in Jeff. And that's how this works. We put in Jeff, and then we say hello to Jeff, and it will console.log that to the screen. So Jeff is being put in there as the name. Another example of a function is this one. So for this function add 2, we're taking in a number. So our number is our f of x input. And then this return statement is an output. So before we were just console.logging something. We weren't giving anything back. But return means you want to give something back to the person who called the function. So when I do return num plus 2, I am giving back the result of this computation to the code. So that means I can actually set this variable equal to this function call. So I can say my number equals add 2 to 5. So I'm calling this function, I'm adding 2 to 5, and then it's giving me back 7. Since it gives me back 7, I'm allowed to say my number equals the result of this. So my number will equal 7. So we print 7 to the screen. And I'm going to have to go a little bit faster just to make sure we have time to actually practice this. But basically, a callback function is a function that's passed into another function. This is getting kind of crazy, but don't worry, it will make more sense when we actually implement it. So the way a callback function works is functions in JavaScript are called first-class objects. That basically just means that you can use a function as if it's a variable, and you can pass them around everywhere and do cool things with them. So basically here what we're doing is we have our say hello function before that prints hello world. And then this function do twice, that when it's given a function, it will call that function twice. So when we run do twice say hello gets passed in as this fn. And then every time this fn is referenced, it's calling say hello. And this can be kind of tricky to wrap your head around. I think functions in general take a little bit of getting used to. But for those of you who have more experience with functions, this demo or like this example will probably be more useful for you. So yeah, this is our say hello function. The function gets passed in as fn, and then it runs it twice. We also have these things called anonymous functions. An anonymous function is basically something that doesn't have a name. We haven't assigned it to a name. So as you can see here before, we were calling say hello, and we defined say hello up here. Well, we can actually just write down here function parameters and then the body, and we can call that. Again, not necessary, but kind of cool. Finally, we have this arrow notation. You'll be seeing this a lot in my example today, and this will be very useful. Basically, it's even more concise way of writing an anonymous function. You basically say, these are my inputs, give me this back, or do this. And it's very much like a math function. So here we have no inputs, arrow, do this, and that's what our function is saying. Okay, I'm gonna pause because again, that was a lot. I also wanna say that this is kind of hard because it's trying to be like an introduction to all of programming. So if you have some programming experience, this might have been a bit of review. If you have no programming experience, I kind of threw you into the deep end, so I really appreciate you sticking with me. I hope everyone's using the questions doc. If there are any questions, you should let me know. All right. Okay, I will move on to the cool part of today's lecture and probably where it will start making more sense. So JavaScript for web development. Let me go here. Okay, so we're back to our HTML, our friendly HTML, not as confusing as all those callback functions and anonymous functions. So we have our HTML, we have this class paragraph. And what we did with Jess is we added a unique ID to our heading, and that allows us to identify it. So now we're getting into the JavaScript. So we had our HTML file, our CSS file, and now what we're going to do is we're going to have a JavaScript file. And the way that this works is we just make another file called blah, blah, blah.js, and I'll explain how we connect it to our HTML later. So the way that you connect your JavaScript to your HTML is somewhat similar to CSS in that what you do is you link up to your document using these classes and IDs that you defined earlier. So the way that it works is you do document.querySelector, and then inside of the selector, you pick the ID that you want. So you remember when we were doing CSS, we would do #title to connect to the title ID, or we do .image to connect to the image class. It's the exact same in JavaScript, where you have #title, and that's how we access our title. This thing called .innerText is going to access this white text inside of the title. A lot of HTML tags will have properties like this. You can Google them to see which ones you're able to access. So here what we're doing is we're printing out the value of the title, and that's the inner text, and it will output a title. Another thing we can do with querySelector is select an HTML element and set it to be something. So here we're saying document.querySelector ID title. So we're going to ID title. It grabs us this element, this HTML element, and then we're going to say, let's set the inner text to be high. So on the screen, when you do this, it will change and the title will now be high. Another thing you can do with JavaScript, which is super cool, is you can define something called an onClick function. And this is super useful for things like buttons and user interaction. Basically, what an onClick function does is it says, when someone clicks this element, run this piece of JavaScript code. So what we're doing here is we're saying title. So we're setting title to be this HTML element. Title.onClick, which is something that is just syntax that we use in JavaScript, equals this function. And what this function does is this alert thing here is going to create a pop-up on a web page. You guys have probably seen pop-ups on web pages before. it will create a pop-up saying you clicked the title. Just going back to this note up here, when you get an HTML element using document.querySelector, it basically behaves like an object where it has these attributes and you can change them and set them to be equal to things. So here we're doing title.onClick and we're setting that to be something. All right. Another way we can do this exact same operation is we can add to the HTML an onClick attribute, and then we can say onClick, we're going to show pop-up. And JavaScript knows that that means we're going to go to the JavaScript file, whoopsies, find the function called show pop-up, and then give an alert saying you clicked on the title. So does anyone have any questions about all of that before I move on to the next part? We'll do some practice in a bit as well. They'll probably help. Okay, I'm assuming that Amanda and Jess are taking good care of you guys on the question doc. So, oh, okay, good question about what is an alert. So you will see this later, but if you've ever been on like a website and it's just thrown like a pop-up at you saying like, this web page is not stable, or people don't really use pop-ups, but it's just like something shows up on your screen and you have to click OK to get rid of it. Honestly, you will not be using it in your projects for Blueprint, most likely, but it's just like a nice visual way to see that your function is working. Okay, so now we're going to talk about APIs. This is the last section before we start coding, and then we'll actually see how JavaScript works. So an API is called an application programming interface. And all that is it allows your code to interact with some other web app's data. So you can interact by creating data, you can get data, you can change data, and you can delete data. So what we'll be doing today is we'll mostly just be getting data from APIs, which is really fun because it allows you to access a lot of information that can make your website really exciting. So one example is the Spotify API. Spotify API is super easy to use. You can ask for information about songs. And I don't know if you guys have seen websites like Obscurify or Receiptify, but they basically interact with the Spotify API to give you guys some extra functionality. Weather API, you can ask for tomorrow's weather. So if I want to make a hackathon project about like weather forecasting, but I don't know anything about the weather forecast, I can use some other weather person's API and get their information about the weather and then display that to you. Calendar API might be like requesting what's going on today. So you get data from a web API is they usually give you a URL. This is called an endpoint. And then the API will give back to you some raw data. And you'll get something that looks like this, which is a little hard to use, but don't worry. So a big question is, why do we need APIs? Well, APIs make it really easy for computers and your web code to figure out what's going on and understand data. If I gave my computer this screenshot of this song, it would not really know what to do with it. But if we gave our website this thing, which is you'll learn about, it's called JSON, and I'll talk about that in a later slide. It's very easy for it to say, oh, this is the album, this is the artist, this is the year, and these are the songs that we're listening to. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be using the dog API. We've been kind of building up to this. But what the dog API is that it will give you a random dog image when you send it a request. And the way it will return it is it will return it in JSON, which is just JavaScript object notation. So the objects that I was telling you guys about earlier. You'll get something like this called message. It'll say message and it will say status. And this message will be a link to a dog. So let me just go to the dog API so you can see. It's basically the internet's biggest collection of open source dog pictures. And if I click this button, it will give me a different dog. And this is the URL that it's using. So we have lots of fun dog images. All right. So the way that we use this API is using something called fetch. Fetch is a built-in JavaScript function that will help you access an API. You put in the URL, so it will fetch from that URL. And then we have to use the special syntax called .then to specify what we want to do with the response. So basically, when we're doing a fetch, we're saying, hey, website, hey, dog API, give me a random dog. And then dog API will send us a dog back, right? It will send us that JSON. What this dot then does is it takes in this response. So we have a function and the response, and then it will console.log that data from the dog API. So let me just show you what this looks like really quick. So let me go to console. Let me fetch dog dot CEO/API/breed/image/random. It's a little annoying. Then we're going to take a function that takes in the response, and then we're going to console dot. Oh, it remembered what I wanted to do. That's great. And then when I send it, it told me that I did something wrong. There we go. Okay. So basically it says, okay, we got data from the dog API, and this is what the response looks like. And this response is very hard to read, as you guys can probably tell. You know, we have lots of things, we don't understand it, we don't know where our data is, and we're going to fix that in a moment. So basically, as you can see, this response is kind of confusing. But what we want to do is call .json to figure out what the actual data is. And that's what this looks like. We have our fetch, we have our dog API endpoint. Then we use this .then, and this .then will take that whole big jumble of information that I just showed you. It will take that response, and this is this arrow function notation I mentioned earlier. It will call .json on that whole icky response. And what that will do is that will turn it into something readable. And I don't actually know if I have time to do that, so I'm going to keep going. But this is what it will look like when you do it correctly. It will show you this message, which is a link to a dog. It's a JPG, and it will show us a status. So now we're finally going to get into the live coding, and we're going to use the dog API. But before I do that, are there any questions about anything that I just covered? I know that was a lot. Okay.
Oh, someone
Yeah.
asked if res is an arbitrary parameter name on the dog. You wanted to answer that?
Perfect. Okay, so yes, res is completely arbitrary. With a lot of functions in general, the variables that you use can be whatever you want as long as you're consistent. So I could say .then, and I could call it like dog. If I want to tell people, oh, I'm getting a dog. And then as long as I say dog.json, it's fine. In the next .then, I could say something completely different. I could say function cat, and then make sure that this is cat, and it would work. That's a good question. Okay, so I'm going to move on to using the dog API. I would say that this is the most challenging lecture of today, so do not fear if you are having some difficulties. So if everyone can navigate to their dog.html, here's mine. It might look a little different. We all styled ours slightly differently, I think. So here's your dog generator. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to start by creating a new file called index.js. And .js tells it that it's a JavaScript file. All right. So what we want to do is in our HTML, we want to link to this JavaScript file. And the way that we link to this JavaScript file is at the very bottom, we're going to use the script tag. And the script stands for JavaScript. So we have this script src equals index.js. That's really similar to the image syntax that we saw earlier on. And then we're going to close the script tag. And that basically just tells our HTML that we're creating something called an index.js JavaScript file and linking to it. Okay, so as you guys can probably tell, the main thing we want to do is that when we find a random dog, we want it to display on the screen, right? So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to create an on-click function for the random button. And I just realized that my buttons are flipped. So that was a little silly, but should be good now. Okay, so for my random button, I'm going to say on-click equals, and then I'm going to put in an arbitrary function name, and I'm about to write this function. So I'm going to call it get random image. So I'm going to give you guys a second to put that in. So we are writing the function get random image. And that's going to be the function that runs when we click that button. So what we're going to do is we're going to then in our JS file write function get random image. And now we're going to fill in this function. So what we're going to do right now is I'm just going to see if it works. And I'm going to console.log. OMG, I'm getting an image. This is so cool. So I'm going to save that and go back to my browser. I'm going to reload. In order to see any console.logs that you include in your code, they're not going to be printed to the screen. So you need to open up the console to see the console.logs that you've put in your code. So when I click find a random dog, it's printing this, OMG, I'm getting an image, and I'm printing it over and over again. So it just says 6 there. So that means that every time I'm clicking this button, the function is running correctly, which is great. It means we've linked up our HTML and our JavaScript files in a very good way. So let me get rid of this console.log because I know that the function works. And now what we're going to do is we're going to copy that code from the slides. And let me copy that link because I forgot what it was. Oh, I can go back to the HTML, no problem. Okay, hopefully that was good. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving on, but if people need me to go back, just let me know. Okay, let me go here. Okay, so I'm just copying from their website what the URL is. So we want to fetch this dog image. Okay, so we fetched this dog thing, and now we have to do the same thing as we did before with the .then. One thing that you'll notice is I'm writing it on a different line. That's totally fine. Since JavaScript doesn't actually care about spacing, it knows that I'm in the same place. Yes, I can paste URL in chat. Good point. There you go. All right, so we have our .then. And what we want to do is do exactly what we did before, where we did res, or I'm going to call it dog now because it's just to show you guys that it works. And then we're just going to make that dog.json. We're going to want to do one other .then after that, where we're going to take a function of the response. And what we're going to do is we're going to console.log res message. If you guys remember from the object description, basically this is going to return us a JavaScript object that has message and status. In the message and status things, you're basically just going to say like res.message to access that link. So that's the link. Let's see if that works. So let's reload, find random dog. And it failed to fetch. Okay, we have an error. That is okay. I'm not sure why there's an error though. Let's see if calling it res will fix it. Because I might have been wrong earlier. No. Is my link wrong? Oh, my link is wrong. I do HTTPS twice. Oopsies. Okay, so when I click this button, as you can see, we get a link to a dog. This is brilliant. And they're different dogs. So that is cool. But as you guys can see, this dog that we have here is not changing, right? So we need to change something using that query selector thing that I mentioned earlier. So let's take a look and figure out what we need to change. So we're looking here and we see that the place that we're displaying the image is here, right? This div class image, and the ID is dog image. So what we're going to do is we're going to run document.querySelector because we want to find the ID that we're looking for. And the ID that we're looking for is dog image, right? Then what we want to do is the property of dog image that we want to change. If you go to the CSS, we want to change the background image, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to say dot background image. Dot style dot background image, and style tells us that we're looking at the CSS. So dot style dot background image. One thing that you'll notice is that in the CSS, it's like background dash image. Whenever you're doing something in JavaScript, you're going to take away that back and capitalize the thing instead. It's just a little syntax thing, but a lot of the time, if something's not working, that'll probably be why. So you have dog image dot style dot background image. And then we're going to set that equal to that URL that we just got, right? So as you saw before, the way we set things equal to a URL is we do URL, and then we will put in res.message, right? But this is wrong, right? We want to put the actual message into the URL. And if you guys will remember, that's what our backticks are for, our lovely, lovely backticks. So I'm going to put backticks around this whole thing. You guys will see why in a minute. So my backticks are here. And then basically what we want to put is we want to include the value of res.message. We don't want to include the literal like res.message. So we're saying URL res.message. So to review again what this line is doing, we're doing fetching from the dog API. Once we get something from the dog API, we're doing a .then, and the .then just takes the response. We're going to do res.json. So we're going to take this response and then take it out the JSON parts of it. Then we're going to do another function with the response. We're going to log the response like I showed before, which is going to print us that URL. And then we're going to do the most important step, which is document.querySelector dog image. So we're finding that element. We're going to its style, and then we're going to the background image of the style. And then we are setting that equal to URL with that res.message in it. And the reason we're doing URL like that is, again, because here we have background image, and then this is the URL with all that inside of it. So let me take a look and see if that works. So let's find random dog. And now we get a random dog, which is super exciting. We've implemented our first button. So I'm going to go back here and give people a chance to look at this code for a little bit. And people can let me know if you have any questions about this section. Yes, I can show HTML. Here you go. The important parts that we added is we added this onClick to link to the JavaScript, and we added this script to link to the JavaScript. All right. So I really want to implement the get specific image function because it's super cool. So I might hold you guys for a little bit past the deadline at 4:40. I hope that is okay. We made no changes to the CSS file. Mine just looks a little different because I just styled it differently, but we have not made any changes together. All right. So we've implemented this find random dog button, right? But now we want to do this thing called find specific dog. And actually, the dog API has a special endpoint for that where you can give it a dog name and it will find you a dog name. So that's the CSS file. So first, let me make the submit onClick function. So the onClick here is going to be get specific dog or get specific image. Then we're going to go to our index.js. I'm just going to keep that here for a second if people want to see it. Function get specific image. And that's going to be this function. So the first thing that we're going to want to do, this is slightly different, is we need to actually get the name of the dog that we want to look up. And if you guys can remember, we have this input here that allows us to input things into our website. So ideally, we'll want someone to give us a name, and then we can take this name and send it out. So the way we get the value of that input is we say constant name. We're going to use our query selector again, our favorite thing, query selector. And then let's go back and see what the input was. So the ID is dog name. So I'm going to copy that, go back to JS. And what we want to do is we want to take the dog name ID. And then what you do here is you do not node value, you do value. So if you're ever not sure what dot thing to put here, you can always Google it. So say like, how do I get the text entered into an input JavaScript? And it will tell you that for this, you want to get the value. This is slightly different than inner text for something else because input is its like special kind of tag. So you get this name, and then we do something very, very similar with fetching, except we have to do something kind of special with our URL. So instead of a random dog, we don't want that. We want to use this other endpoint they have, and I'm copying the link from my iPad, so give me a second. I believe this is the correct link. So basically the way that this link works is we're going to a specific breed name, and then it will give us a random image of that dog breed. And again, we're using the backticks instead of the double quotes to let us insert the value of our name variable. So if I put in the name Samoyed, my favorite dog, this will search API/breed/Samoyed/images/random. Then we're going to want to do basically exactly what we did above. So I'm going to copy it. Except we're going to have to make a change, and you guys might see what that change is in a second. But let's see if this works first. I'm going to reload. I'm going to type in Samoyed, and I'm going to type in find specific dog, and look, it finds so many adorable pictures of Samoyeds. Let's look up a Shiba for Amanda. Look at these cuties. But let's look up something that's definitely not a dog. Let me look up cat. Oh my gosh. If you go to inspect element, we're getting errors. Look, breed not found. We don't really like errors. We want to tell them that they made a mistake. We want the user to know, right? So if you guys can probably remember, the response, the JSON response had a message part and it had a status part, right? So this is just a unique thing of the dog API, but basically if this thing doesn't work, I don't know where they explain this, documentation. I know the answer to this, but basically you'll have to look on documentation to see how each website is managing their own data. But if something goes wrong, what's gonna happen is they're gonna have a res.status equals to error. And we will do something there. And if it's not an error, then we will change the image. So basically we have an error coming up every time we search something that's not a valid dog. It's like going to a URL that doesn't exist. So we want to know if there's an error, we want to tell the person using it, oh my gosh, there was an error. And for that, we're going to use an alert. So we'll write woof woof, no dog found or something. And that's what an alert is. One thing I want to point out that I don't actually think I pointed out in the lecture, in JavaScript, you have to use triple equals signs when you want to see if two things are equal to one another. So single equals signs means that you're assigning a variable to be a value. Triple equals signs means you're asking, are these two things equal? And it will give you back a true or a false. The reason I use triple equals signs is slightly complicated, but basically, for those of you who have some experience, in other coding languages, you'll use a double equals sign, and that will test if two things are equal. In JavaScript, the double equals sign is a little bit finicky. So if I take the number 2 and the string 2, it will think it's the same thing. But sometimes you don't want that behavior. So you should always use a triple equals sign because it's very rigorous. Let me check the chat. Oh, oh yeah, Jess is being lovely and sending the files. That's great. Okay, so let's take a look at dog generator. And let's see what happens if I try and find cat. This is what an alert is. This alert pops up and it says, woof woof, no dog found. So if I put in cat, it doesn't work. If I find random dog, it does great. If I put in, let me think of a good one. Does anyone want to suggest a dog in chat that you really want to see? I know that you guys might be busy with your JavaScript files. Okay, let's see if it works. Sometimes, no, it didn't find it. Okay, I'm gonna keep trying a lab. Okay, maybe it wants Labrador. There we go. So we're getting some labs. Let's look at a corgi. Oh my God, we're getting, oh, these are interesting pictures. These are so cute. Okay, so basically now we have this brilliant functionality for our dog generator, right? We can find random dogs. We can find specific dogs, but it doesn't find that one because it doesn't exist. Let's go back to some Samoyeds. What a cutie. And it didn't take that much JavaScript code to do it. So I'm going to leave this up. This is all the content for today's lecture, but I know that that was a ton of stuff. So I'm going to give you guys time to experiment with it and ask questions if you have them. And if questions, Doc, if Amanda or Jess, you have anything you think like everyone should hear, you can also let me know. Yes. Thank you, Jess.
Do you want to like go over sort of like why we would use?
Someone's asking a question about
arrows
why we
syntax?
use arrow functions. If we can't reuse the function defined by it.
Okay, good point. So the question about arrow functions. So in this case, I'm doing a really short operation, right? I'm doing res equal to res.json. So if I wanted, I could do function process response, let's say. Just say something like this. And what it will do is it will return res.json. And then instead here, I could say, okay, process response. Res. I think this one, let's see. Okay, never mind. It didn't even work. It's a little embarrassing. But basically, the reason that we use arrow functions is because it's just a lot more concise. And when you're dealing with lots and lots of code, and especially for something like this where you don't really care about reusing it because it didn't take you that much time or effort to create, it's like a few characters, we value it only taking up one line of code. Technically, it's not wrong to do it any other way. But as programmers, a lot of the time, we really value clean syntax and keeping things as short as possible. That way that we don't get bogged down by looking at lots and lots of code. So I don't know if that's a very satisfying answer, but it really is just for cleanliness. Arrow functions are very easy to look at, easy on the eyes. And I think they're a lot clearer, honestly. I prefer them because it's super clear that you're like taking this thing and then you're converting it to this thing. So yeah. Also, I can upload all the code files to the drive if you guys want after this lecture. Someone messaged me about that. Or I can upload it as text. Would you guys prefer if I pasted the text into the doc, or would you prefer if I uploaded the files? Paste? Okay, I will paste. Okay, wait, files, text. I will just do both. All right, I've kept you guys long enough. It is 7 minutes past. I'm sorry for taking so much of your time, but I really appreciate you sticking this one out. JavaScript is tough, especially if you're new to programming. So if a lot of this felt really difficult, do not worry. It will be okay. And thank you.